Michael, good to see you. We got published. Did you know that?
Oh man, good vibes all around. Big congratulations. Hopefully this is something that the market finds as thought-provoking and useful as you and I as we negotiated
Totally.
these topics.
Yeah, no. So we worked on this for a while, and it seems to have gotten a lot of attention lately, which is awesome. But maybe for the right reasons, maybe for the wrong reasons. We don't know. We'll find out. History will tell. But here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to have a conversation between you and me, explaining basically this paper because a couple people have read it and they said, I think I get it. We wrote it in a way that is designed for academics. Let's make it more accessible to even more people because I think it affects a lot more people than just academics. So, if it's okay with you, I'll go through. I'm going to ask you the questions that I had initially, and then you ask me the questions that you had initially, and we'll kind of show them how we came to this. Because it is an unlikely combination of legal thought, corporate responsibility, AI, and industry knowledge. So if that's all right with you,
Absolutely. I'm as far out of the AI lane as one could possibly imagine. So this is the type of cross-pollination that's healthy.
yeah, no, and I usually stay away from legal topics, to be honest. So,
Might be a problem, but let's get to it.
yeah, right, right. All right, cool. So, we basically open with the time. This was the Biden administration at the time was talking about civil rights laws and how AI might be discriminatory or have disparate impact. Can you explain? I mean, there was some communications from the FTC, the CFPB, a lot of federal and of course state as well. That people have mentioned this is like a concern for them. I deal with this all the time on the data level. Like, is it actually biased or discriminatory in some way in terms of the data? You're looking at it through a legal lens. One of the first things that when we started talking that I was almost like taken aback by was the mention of this 1964 Civil Rights Act, a major piece of legislation in American history. Can you explain what the relationship here is between Title VII and the 1964 Civil Rights Act and AI? Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. The outset, it's important for the listeners to understand that this paper was initially submitted in 2023 in response to several pronouncements from the then Biden administration, who were discussing the notion of AI being increasingly used to make hiring decisions, lending decisions, and mortgage decisions. And Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act covers all employment decisions. There is also the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. These three acts, 60s and 70s, are the backbone of anti-discrimination laws as it goes to employment, mortgaging, and providing credit, right? So that's a large segment of the American economy. So even though we're no longer in the Biden administration, this is still telling because in this context where we're having companies unilaterally deciding to de-emphasize DEI programs and potentially an administration who's operating as if race no longer exists, these laws passed by large bipartisan legislators still is on the books. And what it creates are one cause of action that is a massive litigation time bomb for companies who aren't aware of how they're making employment decisions. And the one cause of action that's created in Title VII and these other titles, these other acts I'm discussing, is called a disparate impact. And it's when you have a policy that's neutral on its face, like a test people take in order to be promoted. If the test has a negative impact on a group of individuals that have protection under Title VII, and what groups are we discussing? Race, color, national origin, religion, and gender. You can't make any negative employment decision based upon those protected characteristics. So the disparate impact on an individual because of gender, race, etc. So that's what it makes illegal. And so if you have a test to hire for 50 jobs, 50 Caucasians take the jobs, 50 Caucasians apply for the job rather, and 50 Asian Americans apply for the job and say 50 Asians are hired. then you have a literal disparate impact on Caucasian Americans. And so the test is okay, that's a disparate impact. The disparate impact doesn't make it illegal per se. It just it creates what's called an inference of discrimination. And that inference can be rebutted by the company providing what's called, quote, a business necessity defense,
Yeah.
close. And that's essentially that look, yeah, the numbers look a little weird, but our policies are narrowly tailored to meet a legitimate business interest. And we can't adopt these policies or edit them in any other way without compromising our business. That's one step, but saying it doesn't make it so. And the last step in that analysis is that the plaintiff has to provide to rebut the business necessity defense what's called, quote, a less discriminatory way to meet that legitimate business interest. So the problem, and this is what we were discussing, on the side a few years ago on the relation of this and AI. If you have an algorithm that's making hiring, credit, and housing decisions, and the plaintiff has identified a disparate impact, given the expense and expertise involved in constructing a less discriminatory way, it might be an evidentiary bar that might be quite high, or perhaps prohibitively too high for a plaintiff to meet. And if this is occurring in the context where you have law firms who are agreeing to settle with the Trump administration on not pursuing certain cases or maybe taking on certain pro bono cases, or in other ways, just effectively doing what they can to avoid the pronouncements from the Trump administration operating as if race doesn't exist, you have plaintiffs that are in still a bad spot as it goes to federal law. But these laws are still echoed in several states. And American companies are, operating under federal law, yes. But Title VII, these other laws are still echoed in state acts. Okay. And so what I'm saying here is that companies who are taking the leadership of our president are leaving themselves open to a litigation landmine that is there. While on the other side, plaintiffs who are may not be due to plaintiffs' firms being afraid of suing certain firms in this context, might not have the expertise engaged to find this less discriminatory way. And so that's really, goes to a question I have for you. When you are creating an algorithm to engage in, finding the right amount of money to lend to certain areas of the city, or an algorithm to efficiently hire a number of individuals, how much expense, how much time, how much expertise does it take in general to create such a thing?
So it's getting easier. So to answer your question, it's getting easier to create these things, but it is no way cheap. Especially in the AI world, it requires a lot of engineering and usually a lot of training data. And here's where actually I think people get really tripped up is you just use two terms, inference and bias, that are also technical terms in the AI world. And I don't know which, I'm assuming the legal one came first, right? But in the tech, like for example, in statistics, if a model is biased, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's biased towards the data it was trained on as opposed to random, right? So that's, that is generally we do bias models, right? Because we're trying to get them to fit the data, not just a random chance, right?
Yeah,
So it doesn't mean it's bad, but you can be your bias can be biased, right? Which is kind of funny. So
gotcha.
there's a lot of effort putting into building them. There's a lot of effort putting into collecting and outputting data to see if there is disparate impact. Ironically, they call that like they call these fairness indicators. So that's a lot of work that I think some practitioners skip because they say the data is the data, such as, like, and they kind of skip that. So it is more work to do that extra level of sometimes just checking. Sometimes it's totally fine. There's no, nasty bias, if you will, but you got to do the work to check to see if that's true or not, right? The In the world of generative AI, it gets exponentially more expensive. And the reason is just because the sheer amount of data that goes into these large image models and large language models is bigger than most commercial AI systems. It can take, hundreds of human working hours to just get these things stood up for the first time. More importantly, is the training of these can cost millions of dollars, and that's just in computing power and electricity, right? So anything that sort of like, I think the only thing that rivals the cost of building your own large language model would probably be extensive litigation. Right? So really, if you're gonna, it is actually really relevant in a generative AI world, which we're definitely in now. And we had just started talking about this when that came out. So yeah, I think that argument of the cost of litigation is even more relevant today. I just want to clarify something with something you wrote here. Basically, the business necessity part. So, and I'm going to dumb it down as much as I can without being disingenuous. But is it a business can discriminate if they have a legitimate business purpose or legitimate business need, and they have not found a less discriminate or disparate way to do so, to do the same thing? Is that right?
That's absolutely right, Ben. And I have a quick example of that. One of the first firms where I worked as a paralegal when I was 23, we had investigated Ford Motor Company in discriminating against Hispanic American and African American men in how they hired for what was called an apprenticeship program to be a senior engineer. And Ford administered a test that individuals needed to take in order to learn whether or not they would be selected as an apprentice. Just to summarize a few artificial numbers here, effectively, there were, say, 50 Hispanic individuals, African American individuals, 50 white individuals. 80% of the jobs went to these Caucasian Americans. So that is a disparate impact. So there can be a legal disparate impact and an illegal disparate impact. Right. It's only an illegal disparate impact if the plaintiff can show there's a less discriminatory way to meet that legitimate business interest. So what we did in the firm, we got the test, we sent it to a labor economist to see that, are these questions the type of questions an individual who wants to be a senior engineer at Ford Motor Company needs to answer? And look, if there were questions such as, how many jelly beans are in this jar? What is your favorite episode of Breaking Bad? Well, neither of those questions have anything to do with constructing an engine. And so it would be easier to show that there's a less discriminatory way than asking about jelly beans. But we couldn't find any less discriminatory way. So we withdrew from the case. So yeah, Ford Motor Company had created a disparate impact, but they had a test that was narrowly tailored to meet a legitimate business interest. And we could find no less discriminatory way. And this less discriminatory way, to take a bit of a tangent here, it can't be a way that is exorbitantly expensive, right? Let's say, well, you should dump the AI and hire humans. Well, if that, creates a massive business expense such that it impacts substantively the company's ability to perform in the market, that might not pass constitutional muster. It can't be, well, technically it's less discriminatory, but you lose market position. So these have to be tested out. So it can't be harmful.
There's also something important there is that we've also discovered by accident that it turns out, like, for example, not humans doing the job are more discriminatory or biased, and they may not, that could be conscious or unconscious, that we don't know, right? So in some cases we've actually found that the less discriminatory way is automation, which is cheaper and less discriminatory, and we don't know that until we test them side by side. So yeah, that's
really interesting.
Either way.
Yes, the same company, firm I was in, we successfully threatened to sue the NFL at the time for their failure to hire Black coaches. At the time, only Tony Dungy was the coach. And we flew out Donnie Cochran as a co-counsel, had a big presser in Baltimore. And we said, look, you guys only have Tony Dungy and everyone else is a white coach. NFL said, well, we have a business necessity defense. We hire coaches from our retired coaches, and we're the NFL, and we think retired NFL coaches are the best in the world. The problem is that all the retired coaches were white, and they're recycling white individuals.
So their pool was biased, essentially. Is that right?
Exactly. The pool is biased, and so one less discriminatory way is to announce that the job occurs to open up interviews to maybe collegiate level individuals, to interview a number of individuals. So the NFL backed down. They created what's called the Rooney Rule, right, which led to the hiring of Mike Tomlin at the Steelers. Go Steelers! Marvin Lewis at the Bengals. So that operated really good. To your point, NFL is now in another lawsuit because they're using the Rooney Rule as a checkbox and to effectively engage in the type of biased hiring that they were doing before. So, to your point, that humans are naturally biased. I mean, the only reason why these laws exist is because it acknowledges we have a certain nature. Of course, we're going to be more vulnerable with our family and friends and individuals who listen to the songs we do and knows the cultural beats that we do. I mean, that's what this is. We're a tribal species. So even when you have a company like the NFL agreeing to follow a less discriminatory way, these are still run by humans, and humans are naturally biased. And what we're discussing here is not necessarily, I mean, we can come at it from a moral way. I mean, I'm, pro rule of law and against bias, but this is also litigation of risk management. And what we're discussing here is a tool that companies can use in a context that exists independent of whatever political pressures you're under, because we still operate under a rule of law. And even if the federal government has abandoned certain enforcements, it's not going to be the case in New York City, the largest economy, city in the country. It's not going to be the case in LA, where both you and I live, and it's not going to be the case in San Francisco. So we need to get serious and inventive about how we thread these needles as they pop up in real time.
I think you've identified the root of the problem. I've always taken a more data-driven approach whenever possible, and I think that's where actually some of the solution kind of comes about here. Let's go on to the concept of what responsibility the private sector. You're talking about the public sector. You're talking about rule of law, government implement, state law. The private sector has, I'd argue, more freedom and also more risk. Right, that's generally the private sector. You talk about this concept called new governance, which is about. I think everyone's heard of social responsibility. Like, you have a responsibility to your local or maybe even national community to do more than just profit, right? And that's social responsibility. Can you explain new governance in when it comes to social responsibility?
Yeah, excellent. Question, Ben. New governance is technically a critique on corporate social responsibility. The cultural social responsibility movement, the CSR movement, essentially is been co-opted by corporate market strategies. It's effectively in one way, it asks companies to do good for goodness sake, independent of what's happening to their corporate bottom line. And I think that businesses in this country have a legal obligation to maximize the wealth of their shareholders every quarter. And if you have some CEO engaging in these CSR movements for some long-term a morally just, environmentally just goal, they might be endangering their job as a CEO if they're not performing every quarter. And so new governance is saying that, look, we should not be asking companies to be a good moral people as if we're talking to children and our friends to be good moral people. These are organisms created by law that only think in 4-month cycles, graded by how much money they maximize. So you need to speak in that language. And so in the field of AI, by the time you create some law meant to regulate it, because of the nature of this field, by the time you pass a law, it's a dated answer to yesterday's question. And so what new governance does, it tries to decouple general protestations of morality and replace it with, what is the goal? Well, we want to comply with basic laws prohibiting discrimination in employment, bank lending and mortgage lending established in the 60s and 70s, and we want to comply with it. Well, how do we do that in an AI field where the federal government appears to be abandoning certain areas of civil rights law? Well, it appears that it's a data driven problem, and companies are in the best position to understand the nature of the data and
Yeah.
to tease out what the issue is. But you don't want to have companies just divulging all their data publicly to a bunch of plaintiffs' lawyers who might say, well, look, this is a massive disparate impact. By the time you pursue a lawsuit successfully, the damage, will have been done to the whatever plaintiffs, but it'll be 2, 3 years, however long it'll take. If AI using companies can identify through data sharing, scrubbing of all proprietary data, and this is more in your wheelhouse, Ben, but if they can identify these disparate impacts in real time, they'll be able to address these issues far before any plaintiff's attorneys, far before any successful lawsuit can. And so this is about active compliance with the law that is of more service to the public than, well, currently the federal government.
I mean, yeah, I think the question is the goal to regulate, or is the goal to become closer to no bias, no disparate, no negative or bad disparate impact? And I would argue it's the latter, because the former is to try and prevent. So they put in regulation. And your complaint is that, like, people are not sorry, I should say people. The private sector might not be adhering as much, or might be holding back a little bit out of fear of litigation and compliance. My complaint is that regulation is way too slow to even address things to have any positive impact. If it takes a lawsuit, like to your point, it'll take 2 to 3 years to resolve. 2 to 3 years of racist, sexist, any sort of disparate impact is a lot to suffer through for the potential benefit, right? My argument was incentivize speed over litigation, and that brings its own host of problems, which actually brings us to our proposed solution, which is the responsible AI consortium. And I think one of the big topics here is that it is self-regulating. Yes, I think that's self-regulating is faster than government regulation. I think most
Yes.
people agree with that. Um, the question is, has it been perverted in any way? And maybe, right? So let's
I gotta say this, right? Like I'm a CSR guy. And as you know, as we were discussing this paper, I almost didn't like where the logic was leading me. I did the notion of advocating for a self-regulatory model in an expanding new market that is escaping the gravitational pull of government regulators, not only because the regulators can really understand the nature of this technology, but because current regulators are not in a particularly regulatory mood.
right.
So that is a zeitgeist. While, as you rightly say, it takes a long time to address these problems, and if you're these individuals who are suffering a disparate impact, you understand that justice delayed is justice denied.
Yeah.
What I'm seeing here is that if AI using companies can follow the lead of what we're articulating in this article, they will be able to identify, address, and mitigate disparate impact before a trial even gets to the discovery phase.
Yeah,
Okay, so
it would
yes,
provide like you said, you took it to a labor economist. This is a labor economist machine, essentially, right? So it would say, hey, we identified something within minutes, not years, right? We saw, there was disparate impact. The question is, did it make sense, or was it legally justified? And then I think this is actually where it comes into using industry level self-regulation at the industry level, not not. I wouldn't say it's self-regulation. It's industry self-regulation, not organizational self-regulation, right? And I think that's one faster. Two, the barrier to that is trying to get competing firms to coordinate on something is very hard, right? So you have to kind of make sure that no single player is actually running the show. So that's why I think we talk about consortiums, is that we have these and preferably nonprofit industry specific organization that basically takes in aggregate data aggregate the potential biases in these AI models these different industries are using, and looks at them and say, hey, generally we see across a larger data set, and this is the value I think of a responsible AI consortium, is that you have more data at a wider breadth because of multiple organizations sharing. Now, normally that makes them very, very anxious because, just consumer privacy laws, and that's fair. But aggregate level information on like, hey, here's an insurance company, sharing saying, hey, yes, we changed the price of insurance because of the color of the car. Okay, so color of the car is now a potential source of bias, right? Probably not directly, but maybe there's a proclivity to have a pink car is going to be driven more by women than men, maybe, right? Let's just assume that. And they say, okay, well then because you charge different rates for pink paint, does that have a disparate impact on female drivers, right?
Yeah.
And you can say one organization can do that on their own, sure. When multiple organizations in the same industry do it, now we kind of know what's normal. And if it's an industry norm, they may be able to prove that business necessity is that turns out drivers of pink cars get in more accidents, right? Okay, that's worth noting, right? Like, or maybe, whatever the example may be. But then you can say, hey, it's not just this one company that's quote discriminating. It turns out to be a behavioral trend, nothing to do with gender. So I think that's actually what we can kind of get over the concern of data sharing with AI for AI. And that,
Right.
what I mean by that is you use AI to obfuscate the actual detailed data, so no individual's data is shared with competitors. It's shared with a industry-specific nonprofit on the aggregate level, and that industry has a data retention policy that's very strict and applies to everyone in the consortium. So maybe they hold the data for 6 months, maybe they hold it for 7 years, whatever it is, but everyone's on the same page, which means that they have readily available that data from their AI system saying, yes, we're in line, we're normal. And if generally the industry assumes that it's a business necessity, you might actually prevent lawsuits in the first place just by knowing that's available right away. And
Yeah.
that lowers costs, which incentivizes the very good behavior that we're concerned about trying to impose with regulation. Instead, it's imposed faster at a wider level with these rakes as opposed to waiting for legislation and then the subsequent lawsuits, which easily 5 years later, right?
And even though the notion of industry specific AI consortiums self-regulating might be novel, certainly in the AI field, it's not novel in other fields, right? So the American Medical Association exists to establish standards for medical professionals, doctors in this country. The American Bar Association
Yeah.
establishes standards for lawyers in this country as well. And so, this is typical of the new governance movement. It effectively says, look, what is the best way to incentivize a company to effectively comply with both the letter and the spirit of the law? As we've been discussing, the law as such is not going to be competent, arguably, in addressing this discriminatory problem. One way to do it is through, critiques in the media. Another way is a direct citizen action, a protest. Another way is engaging in incentivizing companies to work together to solve this issue, right? So unlike just saying under a typical CSR movement, just be good for goodness sakes, it's saying, look, we agree that we all want to comply with the rule of law. Yes. What's the best way to do it? Law? Sometimes, yes. In this case, it's not looking like the most expedient way to comply proactively with the law. And so, yeah.
I'll say in the AI community, I'd say a vast, vast, vast majority of people individually not only comply, they willingly comply because they are genuinely concerned about it. Vast majority. That doesn't mean at the aggregate organizational level that they do systemically, right? And I'm not no specific organization in mind, but really I've seen like when a bunch of individuals care, sometimes the incentives for said individual all of a sudden it gets lost in the organizational, fog, if you will. And
Yeah.
then you start having these problems. So maybe the individual engineer is doing a fairness indicator check on these systems, but they might not know that their fairness levels are elevated across the board compared to their competitors. Now, that's how would they know that? They don't get access to that data. So it is a data access problem.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
well, I think we've identified the problem. I think we've identified at least a high level the social. I think you call it modes of social control is basically saying like, do you do it for your own good? Do you do it because you think you should? Do you do it because you are forced to, And I've always said this amongst all, and this is like classic in IT policy, is compliance is not acceptance necessarily, right? So when it comes down from the law, there's almost like a do the bare minimum.
Checkbox,
Yeah,
checkbox.
right. Checkbox and not a penny more because you told me to,
I've
right?
attended diversity sensitivity training. I've ended racism.
Nailed
So,
it. So you and I basically propose this thing is under the concept of new governance, we propose responsible AI consortiums. These consortiums are nonprofit, individual organizations coming together, submitting essentially data to this nonprofit that is industry specific. And I think this is actually important because if I've noticed anything when people talk about regulation, they want to regulate the technology, not the industry using the technology. And I actually think that's wrong. The answer is regulate the industry in regards to the technology, right?
right. It's
And I
not the
think
tool. It's how the
responsible AI
tool is being
consortiums.
used.
Yeah, because the technology, one, the law does not move fast enough to keep up with the technology, so you always have a constant problem. And
Yes.
then on the other side, um, the technology is not the root of the problem. Sometimes it's the root of the solution. So inherently, it's not the thing that needs to be regulated. It's the industries that are using it, and some industries use it for widely different purposes, right? Some of it for more heavy on HR, hiring, and onboarding. Other ones are more on the dynamic pricing side, which has
Hmm.
concerns there. And other ones are using it for literally like risk management internally or employee surveillance in some cases, right? So the
Okay.
funny thing is, I think we've actually solved the problem. I think we've solved the incentive problem. I think we've solved the social control problem. It's a question of getting this up and running, which we don't have one right now up and running, at least that I'm aware of, at least as of 2020, early 2025. So,
Hmm.
um, we did have a point here about the data hoarding paradox, which I talk about. This is about data sharing in a safe manner, using AI to obfuscate the individual, but learn about the systemic patterns, which is
Right. And this
exactly what we're
is
worried about.
really the question I primarily had for you in this paper, this data hoarding paradox. Like, if you're the company, you're looking at this paradox. How, I mean, is this data hoarding paradox? Is it actually true? I mean, how large of an incentive is it? Because in a way, this is the largest impediment to creating this cooperation around this issue.
Oh, it's a real problem. I mean, the just ask anyone in HR what percentage of their disciplinary meetings are about people downloading, sharing data they shouldn't have, putting it on systems they shouldn't have been. I mean, they're worried about their own employees. They definitely do not tolerate their competitors finding out. That's there's a term for that when data is shared amongst organizations when it's not. So it's called industrial espionage, right? Like, so it is really, yeah, it is a problem. And that's why actually I think AI might be the solution is that you don't have to share the entire detailed data set of all your customers, all your insurance company customers or whatever. You share the aggregate details, the aggregate information about the color of the car, maybe gender, maybe race, whatever, to make sure that you are not out of line with at least industry norms, but you do that very fast. Right. So
Yeah.
yeah, the data hoarding, and that's why people say like AI is a privacy nightmare. I'm like, AI is also a privacy solution in some cases, right? Because I don't know of a single data science technique that allows you to extract out specific training data out of a model, at least a statistical model. The large language models are a little different. They can be done, but we've gotten good at putting controls on that to prevent that from happening. But it's a great obfuscation device too. So it really is. It's a classic thing. It's not a problem. It's a tool, right?
Yeah.
So yes, it is the data hoarding problem is what's called like intellectual property, industrial espionage. Like it's very real. Yeah. So I think if we can use AI to solve that concern and at the same time make those AI systems better, it's a win-win here.
Yeah. Yeah. What is the downside to this? You know,
It's a little
this
bit
isn't,
more, it's a little bit, what is the downside? That's a fair question.
well, I mean, arguably, you could, companies, right, they have to behave rationally within a political context, right? Imagine, a particularly a fearsome company saying that, look, well, a company who's afraid of the current administration, this might be perceived as a diversity, equity, and inclusion program. No, this is complying with a 1968 law,
Yeah.
complying with the 1974 law, complying with the 1978 law, right? And it's not doing it in the same context of a corporate marketing strategy here at AI whatever. We put X person first because we are trying to be whatever. This is a reporting
Yeah,
requirement.
no, I like that because you could call this a DEI initiative if you wanted. You could also call this an anti-DEI initiative if you wanted, because you're giving uh, more data, more specific data faster to solving the problems that the DEI advocates complain about, which is systemic bias, right? On the
Right.
other side, the criticism of the DEI movement is that it's political in nature.
Mhm.
Not it's a thinly veiled political operation, is what their critics would say. And I
Right.
would argue you've also removed that because now you're using industry specific information that is more accurate and is more data driven. It's not a political discussion; it is a data discussion now. So I actually think it can. You no matter your lens, I actually think that you could see it either way.
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
fair?
Like for example, I mean, that's absolutely fair, Ben, the way you put that. So, Southern California Edison, the company who is currently facing a class action lawsuit for potentially causing the Eden fires in LA.
Yeah.
Individuals found out about how one of their transmission wires might have sparked this blaze because Edison had to report out to their shareholders what their litigation risk was.
Yeah.
That's how this came out. Well, that in a video showing that there was a spark
Yeah, I
coming
saw
from
the
the
actual
tower.
spark. Yeah, right,
It was
right.
that as well. But they had to report to their shareholders what the risk was. Right, that's a reporting requirement. This tool that we're articulating, Bill, Ben, is litigation risk management 101.
Yeah.
This is allowing you to identify before even the plaintiff's attorneys do potentially, which is a good thing. This is a litigation risk. This is what we're doing to address it. Don't know what the downside of that would be.
Yeah, no, I think some people think like I think in the political debate world, they always say, like, oh, this is legal, that you can't sue for that, you can't sue like, and the fact is you can sue for anything. Once you're in, litigation, it's expensive, whether you win or lose, right? No question about that.
Yes. Yes.
So I think this is actually, is it fair to say this is a preventative mechanism?
Absolutely, it's
Yeah.
preventive, right? I mean, law as such, right, by and large, in the corporate environment, the legal and regulatory environment of business, is a preventative measure, right? So this is, this basic work trying to comply with the rule of law, independent of who's in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote, I mean, from the 2022 report is that these systems have the passage of extraordinary advances and innovations. Discrimination protections should be built into their design, and I think that's we're not saying you should build it into the models. There should be frameworks that technical frameworks, organizational frameworks that systemically report this stuff in a safe way to reduce the cost of litigation, sure, but more importantly, to reduce bias, the worst kind of bias, not the questionable bias, the really nasty stuff.
Yeah.
It does it faster.
Yes. We
Right.
want this. This is a good thing because we live in a pluralistic country, in a dynamic, changing world with an undulating market. And so we need to get this right.
Great. I'll post down the link to our paper here, which is called "On Addressing Algorithmic Discrimination Through Developing Responsible Artificial Intelligence Consortiums," aka RAKES, we've been calling them. But
Rake the data.
right, and let's follow that. Thank you. It was actually really fun working with you on this. We come
Absolutely,
from two
Ben.
different worlds, and I think we actually came up with something that hopefully takes off. So I'll let people in the comments, let us know what they think.
Fantastic. Yeah, looking forward to the next collaboration, my man.
Cool. Thank you.
All right.